I remember that day vividly. The sky over Boston seemed to darken with my despair as David's harsh words shattered the life I thought I knew. April in New England is supposed to bring renewal, but that afternoon, standing in our Beacon Hill brownstone, I felt only destruction. His voice, cold and unforgiving, echoed in every corner of our home, leaving a trail of devastation not just in the walls but deep within me. 13 years, I whispered, my voice barely audible over his tirade. 13 years, David. He didn't even pause to acknowledge the time we'd spent building our life together. The wedding at the public garden, the cramped first apartment in Somerville, the promotions we'd celebrated at our favorite North End restaurant, all seemed to mean nothing as he continued his verbal assault. "I don't love you anymore, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion that might suggest he ever had. "I haven't for a long time." The casual cruelty of his words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. I stood frozen in our living room, where just last Christmas we'd hosted his entire family. The Manning family portrait still hung over the fireplace, a lie captured in an elegant black frame. "There's someone else," he continued, not even having the decency to look ashamed. "Her name is Melissa. She works in accounting." Of course it was Melissa from accounting. I'd met her at the company holiday party 6 months ago. She'd complimented my dress while refilling her champagne glass, and I'd thanked her, completely unaware that she was already sleeping with my husband. "You need to leave," David said, gesturing toward the door as if I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. "Tonight? This is my home too," I managed, finding my voice despite the shock. The mortgage papers had both our names. The kitchen renovation had been my design. The hydrangeas in the garden were my mother's. "Not anymore." His tone was final, brooking no argument. "I've already spoken with my lawyer. You'll be hearing from him." Thunder rumbled outside, a perfect accompaniment to the storm raging within our home. I glanced at the window and noticed fat raindrops beginning to splatter against the glass. The weather matched my mood, dark, turbulent, threatening to overflow. "Can I at least pack some things?" I asked, hating the pleading note in my voice. "Be quick about it." I moved through our bedroom in a daze, grabbing essentials with trembling hands. The closet we shared now felt like foreign territory. His expensive suits hung beside my dresses, a facade of unity that had apparently been crumbling for months without my knowledge. Family photos smiled up at me from the dresser, lies frozen in time. I left them there, unable to bear the sight of our happier days. Instead, I filled a suitcase with clothes and toiletries, moving mechanically while my mind struggled to process what was happening. When I returned to the living room, David was on his phone, smiling at something on the screen. The expression vanished when he noticed me, replaced by impatience. "That's all you're taking?" he asked, eyeing my single suitcase and tote bag. "For now," I replied, knowing I would have to fight for everything else. The thought exhausted me before the battle had even begun. He opened the front door without another word. The rain had intensified, cascading down in sheets. I hadn't even thought to grab an umbrella. "David," I said his name softly, one last attempt to reach the man I'd loved for over a decade. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or the faintest trace of the kindness I'd once known. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "It's over, Sarah. It's been over for a long time. You just didn't want to see it." As he hurled these final insults and demeaning accusations, I felt a profound sense of betrayal and isolation wash over me. Every syllable he uttered intensified the sting of rejection, transforming my memories of love into bitter reminders of loss. I stepped out into the rain, my tears merging with the downpour. The door closed behind me with a finality that reverberated through my body. Standing on his front steps, I was suddenly a stranger in the neighborhood I'd called home for years. Commonwealth Avenue stretched before me, its elegant townhouses now seeming to stand in judgment of my failure. The weight of my bags felt insignificant compared to the burden of my broken heart. I began walking without direction, each step taking me further from the life I'd known and deeper into uncertainty. It was in that moment, soaked to the skin and shivering in the April rain, that I understood I had reached a breaking point, an irreversible moment that would define the rest of my journey. The David I had known was gone, if he had ever truly existed. The life we had built together had been reduced to a suitcase of clothes and a tote bag of essentials. I found myself at Boston Common as dusk settled over the city. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, and the park was nearly empty. I sat on a bench, watching as lights began to flicker on across the skyline. Somehow, the city continued to exist, unaffected by the collapse of my world. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my friend Jenna. "You okay?" David just changed his relationship status. So it was already public. The humiliation burned as hot as the betrayal. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Not yet. I needed to process what had happened before I could explain it to anyone else. As night fell over Boston, I finally stood from the bench, my limbs stiff from cold and shock. I had nowhere to go, no plan for what came next. But I knew I couldn't stay in the park all night. With one last look toward Beacon Hill, toward the home that was no longer mine, I turned and walked away, each step a small act of defiance against the despair threatening to consume me. I spent that first night at Jenna's apartment in Jamaica Plain. Her concerned face greeted me at the door, taking in my rain-soaked clothes and red-rimmed eyes without a word. She simply wrapped me in a hug, led me to her bathroom, and handed me a towel and dry clothes. "He threw you out," she asked later, as we sat at her kitchen table with mugs of tea growing cold between us. The clock on her microwave read 2:17 a.m., but sleep felt impossible. Just like that, I confirmed, my voice hollow. 13 years, and he couldn't even give me a week to find a place. Jenna's expression darkened. That bastard. I never trusted him, not since that Christmas party when he got drunk and flirted with my sister. I'd forgotten about that incident, or perhaps I'd chosen to overlook it, filing it away with other small transgressions I'd forgiven in the name of marriage. How many warning signs had I missed? "You can stay here as long as you need," Jenna said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. The couch pulled out. Her kindness nearly undid me. I managed a nod before the tears came again, hot and relentless. Jenna moved her chair next to mine and held me while I sobbed, her presence a small anchor in the storm of my grief. Morning arrived with brutal brightness. For a blissful moment upon waking, I forgot what had happened. Then reality crashed down, heavier than before. I was homeless, my marriage was over, and my husband had been cheating on me with Melissa from accounting. I checked my phone to find 17 missed calls, 5 from my mother in Worcester, 3 from my sister in Providence, and the rest from friends who had seen David's relationship update. There were also dozens of texts expressing shock, sympathy, and outrage on my behalf. The story of my humiliation had spread overnight, becoming public knowledge while I slept on Jenna's pull-out couch. I couldn't face any of them yet. Instead, I called in sick to the publishing house where I worked as an editor, grateful that David and I had chosen different career paths. At least I wouldn't have to see him at the office. The next few days passed in a blur of practical concerns and overwhelming emotions. I arranged for a leave of absence from work, citing personal emergency. I opened a separate bank account and transferred my portion of our savings, half expecting David to have emptied it already. I contacted a divorce attorney recommended by one of Jenna's colleagues. Each task was a small step toward accepting my new reality, but the pain remained acute, a constant companion. On the 5th day after David had thrown me out, I received a text from him. "Need to get the rest of your things. I'll be out Saturday from 10 to 2. Use your key, but leave it when you're done." No apology, no acknowledgement of the abrupt way he'd ended our marriage. Just a 4-hour window to collect the remnants of my life. That Saturday, Jenna and her boyfriend, Miguel, helped me rent a U-Haul and drove with me to Beacon Hill. My hands shook as I inserted my key into the lock of what had once been my home. Inside, everything looked the same yet completely different. The furniture we'd chosen together, the art we'd collected over the years, the books lining our shelves, all unchanged but now foreign to me. I half expected to find evidence of Melissa, a sweater draped over a chair, a different brand of coffee in the kitchen, but there was nothing obvious to indicate another woman had taken my place. "Where should we start?" Jenna asked, her voice gentle. bedroom," I replied, steeling myself for the most personal part of this extraction. We worked methodically, boxing up my clothes, jewelry, and personal items. Miguel handled the heavy lifting, loading boxes into the truck without complaint. I found myself oddly detached, as if observing someone else's life being dismantled and packed away. In the home office, I paused before the bookshelf that held my collection of first editions, a passion David had always tolerated but never shared. My fingers trailed along their spines, remembering the story behind each acquisition. These, at least, were undeniably mine. "Take them all," Jenna urged, seeing my hesitation. "Don't leave anything you care about." She was right. I began carefully wrapping each volume in packing paper, placing them in a box marked fragile. As I reached for a copy of Jane Eyre, I noticed a folder tucked behind it. Curious, I pulled it out. Inside were bank statements, not from our joint account, but from one I didn't recognize. David's name was on them, along with transactions dating back 2 years. Large withdrawals, transfers to accounts with only numbers for identification. Money that had been disappearing without my knowledge. "What is it?" Jenna asked, noticing my frozen posture. I handed her the folder wordlessly. She flipped through it, her eyes widening. "Sarah, this looks like, has he been hiding money?" "Apparently." My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Another betrayal to add to the growing list. I should give this to my lawyer. I tucked the folder into my tote bag, a strange calm settling over me. The pain was still there, but alongside it grew something new, a spark of determination, a flicker of righteous anger. We finished packing around noon. As I did a final walkthrough, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator covered in magnets from places we'd visited together. Santorini, where he'd proposed. Barcelona, for our 5th anniversary. The Berkshires, where we'd spent countless summer weekends. On impulse, I took the Santorini magnet, a small blue and white dome against an azure sky, and slipped it into my pocket. Not as a memento of happier times, but as a reminder of what I'd survived. Before leaving, I placed my key on the entryway table. The small metallic sound it made seemed to echo through the empty hallway, a period at the end of a 13-year sentence. Outside, Miguel was securing the last few boxes in the truck. Jenna stood on the sidewalk, scrolling through apartment listings on her phone. "There's a place in Davis Square that might work," she said as I emerged. 1 bedroom, month-to-month lease. "We could look at it this afternoon." I nodded, gazing up at the brownstone one last time. Spring was asserting itself in Boston, cherry blossoms and tulips brightening the tree-lined street. New beginnings were possible, even after devastating endings. "Actually," I said, "let's look at the place in Davis Square tomorrow. Today, I want to go see my lawyer with these bank statements. Then maybe we could get dinner somewhere nice." My treat. Jenna's surprise gave way to a smile. "That sounds like a plan." As we drove away from Beacon Hill, I felt a subtle shift within me. The pain I carried was real, but it also carried the seeds of transformation. Slowly, I resolved that I would not allow that day to define my existence, nor would I be forever shackled by the cruelty of David's dismissal. That day, as I handed over evidence of his financial deception to my attorney, Martha Chin, I silently vowed that he would come to regret the moment he underestimated me. Not out of a desire for revenge, but because justice deserved to be served. "This changes things," Martha said, reviewing the statements with professional interest. "If he's been hiding assets, the court will not look favorably on that." "What should I do next?" I asked. "Focus on rebuilding your life," she advised. "Find a place to live, maintain your employment, keep detailed records of expenses. Let me worry about the legal strategy." Her confidence was reassuring. For the first time since David had thrown me out, I felt a glimmer of hope that something good might eventually emerge from this wreckage. That evening, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, I found myself actually laughing at one of Miguel's jokes. The sound surprised me. I hadn't expected to feel anything resembling joy for a very long time. To new beginnings, Jenna proposed, raising her wine glass. To survival, I countered, clinking my glass against hers. And to whatever comes next. The apartment in Davis Square wasn't perfect. The kitchen was barely large enough for a mini fridge and microwave, the bathroom sink dripped persistently, and the upstairs neighbor seemed to practice river dancing at midnight. But it was mine, or at least it was mine for the next 6 months, which was all the stability I could manage at the moment. I spent the first weekend arranging my reduced life in the new space. My furniture from the Beacon Hill house wouldn't fit, so I'd put most of it in storage. Instead, I'd bought a futon from IKEA, a small desk from a thrift store in Cambridge, and a bookshelf that Miguel had helped me assemble. My first editions were the first things I unpacked, arranging them carefully on the middle shelf where I could see them from anywhere in the main room. "It's cozy," my mother said diplomatically when she visited from Worcester, bringing homemade lasagna and concerned glances. She didn't ask about David, for which I was grateful. Instead, she helped me hang curtains and suggested places to find affordable houseplants. "You always did well with ferns," she reminded me, as if my ability to keep vegetation alive might somehow be relevant to my current situation. But in a strange way, it was. The day after she left, I went to a nursery in Cambridge and bought 3 small plants, a fern, a pothos, and a peace lily. Caring for something living felt like a small act of faith in the future. 2 weeks after moving in, I returned to work. The publishing house where I'd worked for the past 8 years had been understanding about my abrupt leave of absence, especially once I'd explained the circumstances to HR. My colleagues greeted me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity, careful not to ask direct questions, but clearly hoping I might volunteer information. "I'm doing okay," became my standard response to their concerned inquiries. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. I was functioning, which seemed like achievement enough for now. My work provided welcome distraction. As a senior editor in the fiction department, I had manuscripts to review, authors to correspond with, and deadlines to meet. During those first weeks back, I threw myself into these tasks with an intensity that surprised even me. I stayed late at the office, brought manuscripts home to read over weekends, and volunteered for additional projects. "You don't have to prove anything," my boss, Eleanor, said gently one evening when she found me still at my desk well past 7. "Your job isn't in jeopardy." "I know," I replied, not looking up from the manuscript I was annotating. "I just need to stay busy." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd been through her own divorce years earlier, an amicable one, from what I'd heard, but still a loss. "Just don't forget to breathe occasionally," she advised before leaving. It was good counsel, though I wasn't ready to take it yet. Staying busy meant staying numb, and numbness was preferable to pain. The problem was, numbness didn't discriminate. It blocked joy as effectively as it blocked sorrow. This realization hit me one Saturday morning in June, about 6 weeks after David had thrown me out. I was walking through the farmer's market in Union Square, passing stalls of early summer produce without really seeing them, when a street musician's melody caught my attention. He was playing "Here Comes the Sun" on a battered acoustic guitar, his voice rough but sincere. I stopped to listen, dropping a $5 bill into his open guitar case. As the familiar Beatles lyrics washed over me, I felt something crack open inside, not the sharp pain of heartbreak, but something softer, more bittersweet. For the first time in weeks, I was feeling something beyond numb determination. The song ended, and the musician nodded his thanks for my contribution. I continued walking through the market, but with a new awareness. The strawberries at one stand were vibrantly red against their green containers. A child's laughter rang out as she chased a butterfly between stalls. The air smelled of fresh bread from a local bakery's display. On impulse, I bought a small bunch of sunflowers from a flower vendor. Their bright yellow faces seemed to radiate a simple joy that had been absent from my life for too long. That afternoon, after placing the sunflowers in a mason jar on my windowsill, I called Jenna. "I think I need help," I admitted when she picked up. "I'll be there in 20 minutes," she responded immediately, concern evident in her voice. "No, not that kind of help," I clarified quickly. "I mean professional help. A therapist." "Oh!" The relief in that single syllable was palpable. "I can help with that too. My friend Rachel is a therapist in Porter Square. She's fantastic." The following Wednesday, I had my first appointment with Dr. Rachel Goldman. Her office was painted a calm sage green, with comfortable chairs and no clinical sterility. She had kind eyes behind fashionable glasses and didn't rush to fill silences with platitudes. "What brings you here today?" she asked after I'd settled into the chair across from her. "My husband threw me out of our house 6 weeks ago," I began, then stopped, surprised by the bluntness of my own words. "That's not. I mean, there's more to it than that." "I'm sure there is," she agreed. "We have time to explore all of it." But sometimes the simplest statements carry the most truth. Over the next hour, I outlined the basic facts of my situation. David's affair, his abrupt eviction notice, the hidden bank accounts, the divorce proceedings now underway. Dr. Goldman listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to tell my story at my own pace. "What do you hope to gain from therapy?" she asked toward the end of our session. I considered the question carefully. I want to understand how I missed the signs. I want to learn how to trust again, not just others, but myself. And I want to figure out who I am now without him. She nodded. "Those are excellent goals. They're also complex ones that will take time." "I have time," I replied, realizing as I said it that it was true. Despite everything, I still had a future stretching before me, uncertain and unplanned, but mine to shape. In the weeks that followed, therapy became an anchor in my evolving routine. Dr. Goldman and I explored patterns in my marriage that I'd been blind to, the subtle ways David had isolated me from friends, his dismissal of my ambitions, his financial control. We discussed my family history, including my parents' own troubled marriage and eventual reconciliation, which had perhaps taught me to endure rather than confront. Recognizing these patterns doesn't mean you were responsible for his behavior, Dr. Goldman emphasized during one particularly difficult session. He made his choices, but understanding the dynamics can help you avoid similar situations in the future. Meanwhile, Martha Chen kept me updated on the divorce proceedings. David had initially proposed a settlement that would have left me with little more than my personal possessions and a token financial payment. "He's counting on your desire to avoid conflict," Martha explained during one of our meetings. "But the hidden accounts change everything. If we take this before a judge, he risks more than just an unfavorable financial settlement." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Financial fraud during marriage can have serious consequences, especially given his profession in finance. His firm would take a dim view of such behavior, not to mention potential legal ramifications." The knowledge gave me leverage, though I felt no triumph in it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice and the means to rebuild my life. Outside of work, therapy, and legal consultations, I began to cautiously expand my world. Jenna convinced me to join her book club, where I met women from various walks of life, each with their own stories of resilience. Miguel taught me basic self-defense techniques in the park on Sunday mornings, insisting that physical confidence would translate to emotional strength. Planting your feet firmly, he demonstrated one morning, showing me a proper stance, is as much about asserting your right to occupy space as it is about physical balance. I took his words to heart, both literally and metaphorically. I was learning to occupy space in my own life again, to assert my needs and boundaries without apology. In July, I received an unexpected email from my former neighbor in Beacon Hill, Mrs. Abernathy. She was a widow in her 70s who had lived next door to David and me for years, occasionally bringing over cookies or inviting us for tea. "Dear Sarah," her message began. "I hope this finds you well despite the circumstances. I've been meaning to reach out since I learned of your separation. If you're amenable, I'd love to have you over for tea this Saturday. There's something I think you should know." Curious and touched by her outreach, I accepted the invitation. That Saturday, I found myself back on my old street for the first time since collecting my belongings. The familiar brownstones, the corner where the lilacs bloomed in May, the stoop where I'd sat reading on summer evenings, all brought a twinge of nostalgia, but surprisingly little pain. Mrs. Abernathy welcomed me with a warm hug and led me to her small back garden, where she'd set up a tea service on a wrought iron table. "You're looking well," she observed, pouring Darjeeling into delicate cups. "Better than I expected, to be frank." "I'm getting there," I admitted. "Some days are harder than others." She nodded, adding a spoonful of honey to her tea. I wanted to tell you that I've seen her, the young woman. She's been staying there, though they seem to think they're being discreet. I'd assumed as much, but the confirmation still stung slightly. Melissa. Yes, that's the name I've heard. But there's something else. Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the privacy of her garden. Last week, I overheard them arguing. Quite loudly, actually. Something about money he'd promised her, investments that hadn't materialized. I sipped my tea, processing this information. He's lying to her too. So it would seem. Mrs. Abernathy studied me with kind eyes. I thought you should know. Not to cause you pain, but because sometimes understanding the true nature of what we've lost can help us let go of it. As I walked back to the tea station after our visit, I realized she was right. The David I had mourned, the man I thought I'd married, had never really existed. The person who had shared my home for 13 years was capable of deception on multiple levels, not just with me, but with the woman for whom he'd discarded our marriage. The revelation didn't erase the hurt, but it transformed it somehow. The pain became less about personal rejection and more about the universal disappointment of discovering someone's true character. And that, strangely, was easier to bear. By August, the divorce proceedings were progressing. David, faced with evidence of his financial deception, had become more amenable to a fair settlement. Martha was cautiously optimistic that we might avoid a protracted court battle. He's motivated to keep this quiet, she explained during a phone update. His firm's compliance department has already asked questions about some of his transactions. The knowledge should have brought satisfaction, but mostly I felt a growing sense of detachment from the outcome. The legal aspects of untangling our lives seemed increasingly separate from my emotional recovery, which was following its own timeline. During this period of intense introspection, I immersed myself in therapy and personal development. Dr. Goldman introduced me to journaling as a way to process my thoughts, a practice I initially resisted but gradually came to value. Each evening, I would write about my day, my feelings, my hopes for the future. Sometimes I wrote letters to David that I never intended to send, pouring out anger and grief that needed expression but not an audience. The pain gradually transformed into a burning resolve to rebuild my life piece by piece. Every tear shed became a step toward understanding that my worth was never contingent on David's validation or anyone else's. With each passing day, I became more determined to prove that I was not only capable, but deserving of happiness and respect. By September, the lease on my Davis Square apartment was nearing its end. The place had served its purpose as a temporary haven, but I was ready for something more permanent, a space that wasn't defined by what I'd lost, but by what I was creating. Have you thought about buying? Eleanor asked one afternoon at work. We were sharing lunch in the small courtyard behind the publishing house, enjoying the last warm days before autumn. Buying? I almost laughed. I'm not sure that's in the cards right now. The settlement from your divorce might make it possible, she pointed out. Martha thinks you'll be getting a substantial amount, right? She wasn't wrong. The evidence of David's financial deception had strengthened my position considerably. Martha's most recent estimate suggested I would receive not only half of our visible assets, but additional compensation for the hidden funds. I hadn't really considered it, I admitted. Homeownership still feels like something from my old life. Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. Just a thought. Sometimes owning your own space can be part of claiming your independence. Her words stayed with me, prompting me to call a realtor the following weekend. Lisa Rodriguez came highly recommended by one of the women in my book club. She was pragmatic, straightforward, and didn't waste time with properties that didn't match my criteria. What are you looking for, Sarah? She asked during our first meeting at a cafe in Harvard Square. Something small but with character, I replied, surprising myself with the clarity of my vision. A place with good natural light for reading. Maybe a small outdoor space. Nothing in Beacon Hill. She smiled at the last requirement. Understood. What about Somerville? Not Davis Square. It's gotten too expensive, but maybe Union Square or Winter Hill. They're up and coming, still have some reasonable deals. Over the next few weekends, Lisa showed me several possibilities. Some were too cramped, Others needed more work than I could handle, and a few were simply wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Then, on a crisp October morning, she brought me to a condo in a converted Victorian in Winter Hill. The building was divided into 4 units about 10 years ago, she explained as we climbed the front steps. This one's on the 2nd floor, faces south, and has a small balcony. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt a connection to the space. The living room had bay windows that bathed the hardwood floors in golden light. The kitchen was small but updated, with a breakfast nook perfect for morning coffee. The single bedroom could easily fit my bed and a reading chair. And the balcony, though barely large enough for 2 chairs, offered a view of the Boston skyline in the distance. "What do you think?" Lisa asked, watching my face as I explored. "I think," I said slowly, "this might be home." 2 weeks later, my offer was accepted. The timing aligned almost too perfectly. The divorce settlement came through just days before closing. David had ultimately agreed to terms rather than risk further investigation into his financial activities. I signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday and the mortgage documents that Friday. To new beginnings, Jenna said that night, echoing her toast from months earlier as she, Miguel, and I celebrated with champagne on the empty floor of my new condo. We'd brought folding chairs and takeout Chinese food, laughing as we ate from containers balanced on our knees. To ownership, I replied, clinking my plastic cup against hers. The word carried weight beyond real estate. That weekend, friends helped me move my few belongings from the Davis Square apartment and the storage unit where I'd kept items from my previous life. My futon looked small in the new bedroom, prompting a furniture shopping trip with my mother, who insisted on buying me a proper bed as a housewarming gift. "Every fresh start needs a good night's sleep," she declared as we browsed a furniture store in Medford. Gradually, the condo transformed from an empty space to my home. I painted the living room a warm ivory that changed with the light throughout the day. I hung art that I had chosen, not expensive pieces like David had preferred, but prints and photographs that spoke to me. My first editions occupied a place of honor on built-in shelves flanking the bay window. The plants from my temporary apartment thrived in the southern exposure, joined by new additions until the windowsills hosted a miniature garden. I found myself talking to them sometimes, sharing thoughts I wasn't ready to express elsewhere. The settlement was fair, I told a particularly attentive Fern one evening after a final call with Martha. More than fair, really. But money doesn't fix everything, does it? In November, I hosted Thanksgiving for the first time, a small gathering including my mother, sister, Jenna, Miguel, and 2 colleagues from work who had nowhere else to go. The dining table barely fit in the breakfast nook, and we had to use mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors, but no one seemed to mind. "This is lovely, Sarah," my mother said as we washed dishes together afterward. "Not just the meal, all of it. You've created something beautiful here." Her approval meant more than I expected. Throughout my marriage, she had maintained a polite relationship with David while never quite warming to him. Now I understood her reservations had been well-founded. "I'm still figuring it out," I admitted, handing her a plate to dry. "Some days are easier than others." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's just life, dear. The hard days make the good ones sweeter." As winter settled over Boston, I established routines that anchored my days. Morning coffee on the balcony, even in December, bundled in a heavy sweater, watching the neighborhood wake up. Evening walks through nearby Foss Park, where elderly men played chess at concrete tables and young families exercised dogs despite the cold. Saturday mornings at the Winter Hill Brewing Company, where I'd bring a manuscript to review while enjoying their excellent coffee. It was at the brewery, shortly before Christmas, that I met Tom. He was there every Saturday too, usually with a stack of papers to grade. A high school English teacher at Somerville High, he had salt and pepper hair despite being only in his early 40s and a quiet laugh that carried across the room. We had nodded to each other for weeks before he finally approached my table, coffee mug in hand. "Mind if I join you? My usual spot by the window is taken." I hesitated only briefly before gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Be my guest." Our conversation that morning flowed easily, from the manuscript I was editing, a debut novel set in 1920s Boston, to the essays he was grading, his students' interpretations of The Great Gatsby. We discovered shared interests in classic literature, jazz, and the ongoing debate about whether Dunkin' Donuts coffee was actually good or merely a Massachusetts tradition too ingrained to question. Tradition, Tom declared firmly. It's objectively mediocre, but it's our mediocre coffee. I laughed, surprising myself with the sound. Careful, that's borderline heresy in these parts. When the brewery began transitioning from morning coffee service to afternoon beer, we reluctantly gathered our things. "I've enjoyed talking with you, Sarah," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes holding mine. "Maybe we could do it again sometime? Perhaps over dinner?" The invitation hung between us, unexpected and slightly terrifying. I hadn't dated since before my marriage, hadn't even considered it a possibility until very recently. "I should tell you," I said carefully, "I'm recently divorced." "Very recently." Tom nodded, no judgment in his expression. "I understand. No pressure. The offer stands whenever, if ever, you're ready." I appreciated his approach more than I could articulate. "Thank you. Can I think about it?" "Of course." He pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote his number on a napkin. "Ball's in your court." I didn't call him immediately. Instead, I discussed the encounter with Dr. Goldman during our next session. "What's holding you back?" she asked, her tone curious rather than challenging. "Fear," I admitted after considering the question. "Not of Tom specifically, he seems genuinely nice. But of making another mistake. Of trusting the wrong person." "That's perfectly natural," she assured me. "But at some point, staying safe becomes its own kind of risk. The risk of missing out on connections that could bring joy to your life." Her words resonated, though I wasn't quite ready to act on them. Christmas came and went. I spent it with my family in Worcester, grateful for their support, but also for the train that brought me back to my own space afterward. On New Year's Eve, Jenna and Miguel hosted a party at their Cambridge apartment. The gathering was small, just a dozen or so friends sharing food, drinks, and resolutions for the coming year. "What about you, Sarah?" Miguel asked as midnight approached. "Any resolutions?" I considered the question, thinking about the year that had passed, its unexpected devastation and equally unexpected growth. I think my resolution is to say yes more often. To possibilities, to experiences, to life. After the countdown, amid hugs and well wishes, I slipped away to the balcony for a moment of quiet. The city spread before me, lights twinkling against the dark sky. Fireworks burst over the harbor in the distance, welcoming a new year and new beginnings. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and the napkin I'd kept in my wallet. Tom answered on the third ring, background noise suggesting he was at another party. "Sarah?" He sounded surprised but pleased. "Happy New Year," I said, my heart racing with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope. "About that dinner, what about Saturday?" In this fresh environment, I had set up routines that nourished my soul, morning walks in Foss Park, evenings filled with self-reflection, and quiet moments of gratitude that celebrated even the smallest victories. I dedicated myself to pursuing passions that had long been neglected during my marriage, rekindling my love of writing poetry and exploring photography. Every new day was a step further from the chains of my former life. This period of rebuilding was not without its challenges, but with every obstacle, I found an opportunity to learn and grow. I sought out community support, joined groups that shared similar experiences, and discovered that shared strength could turn even the deepest wounds into sources of empowerment. My new life was not merely a refuge, it was a declaration of self-worth and a promise of better days ahead. As the new year dawned, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next, not as David's ex-wife, but as Sarah, whole and healing on my own terms. I'd thought the divorce was behind me. The settlement had been finalized, the papers signed, the assets divided. I was building my new life in Winter Hill, going on occasional dates with Tom, and feeling more like myself with each passing day. Then, in late February, Martha called with unexpected news. "The SEC is investigating David," she said without preamble when I answered my phone during lunch break. They've subpoenaed records from his firm relating to certain investment activities. What does that have to do with me? I asked, stepping away from my colleagues into the stairwell for privacy. We're divorced. It's done. Not entirely, Martha replied, her voice measured as always. Some of these activities occurred during your marriage. They want to question you about what you knew. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't know anything. That was part of the problem. I believe you, Martha assured me. But you'll need to convince them of that. We have a meeting scheduled with investigators next week. The meeting took place in the sterile conference room of a downtown government building. 2 SEC investigators, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a younger man who barely spoke, questioned me for 3 hours about David's financial activities, his home behaviors, conversations we might have had about investments. I answered truthfully, which mostly meant repeating I didn't know, and he didn't share that information with me until the words lost meaning. Mrs. Manning, the female investigator, began. Miss Callahan, I corrected automatically, having reclaimed my maiden name after the divorce. I'm no longer Mrs. Manning. She nodded, making a note. Miss Callahan, you were married to Mr. Manning for 13 years, shared a home, joint accounts, and a social life. Are you asking us to believe you had no knowledge whatsoever of his financial dealings? Not no knowledge, I clarified, straightening in my chair. I knew about our mortgage, our regular accounts, our retirement funds. What I didn't know was that he had opened separate accounts, moved money offshore, or engaged in whatever activities you're investigating. And why do you think that was? She pressed. I met her gaze steadily. Because he deliberately kept me in the dark. Because he constructed our marriage to ensure I didn't ask questions about finances. Because, as I later discovered, he was deceptive about many aspects of our relationship, not just money. Something shifted in her expression, not quite sympathy, but perhaps recognition. The meeting concluded shortly after, with no clear indication of whether they believed me or what might happen next. You did well, Martha assured me as we left the building. Straightforward, consistent, and credible. Will there be more meetings? I asked, dreading the prospect of having David back in my life, even peripherally. Possibly, she admitted. The investigation is ongoing. But your part may be done, especially if they focus on activities after your separation. I hoped she was right, but a nagging worry remained. The investigation represented an unwelcome connection to David, a thread I couldn't quite cut. Life continued. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Boston, patches of snow giving way to hints of green. Tom and I settled into a comfortable routine of Saturday dinners and occasional weeknight movies. He was patient with my hesitations, understanding when I needed space, and genuinely interested in my work and thoughts in a way David never had been. You know, he said one evening as we walked along the Charles River, you never talk about your writing. Only the manuscripts you edit. I glanced at him, surprised. How did you know I write? He smiled, a touch sheepish. You have the callus. He gestured to my middle finger. Same one I get during grading season, but yours is permanent. Writer's mark. The observation touched me, both his attention to detail and his gentle encouragement. That night, I showed him some of the poetry I'd been writing since the divorce. Mostly fragmented verses about reinvention and resilience, nothing I'd considered sharing before. These are beautiful, Sarah, he said after reading them, his expression serious. They deserve to be read. His belief in my words planted a seed, a possibility I hadn't considered. Perhaps my experiences, translated through poetry, might resonate with others undergoing similar transformations. In early April, almost exactly a year after David had thrown me out, Martha called again. Her tone was more urgent than usual. The investigation has escalated, she informed me. They found evidence of significant fraud, both before and after your marriage ended. David is facing potential criminal charges. I sat heavily on my couch, absorbing the news. What does this mean for me? They want you to testify before a grand jury, Martha said. About the financial documents you found, the extent of your knowledge, everything we covered in our meeting. The prospect filled me with dread. Not just the public testimony, but the inevitable resurfacing of feelings I'd worked so hard to process. Do I have a choice? "You'll receive a subpoena," Martha replied, her voice softening slightly. "Legally, no. But Sarah, this may be important, not just for the case, but for you. A chance to speak your truth publicly, to set the record straight." I thought of Dr. Goldman's words from months earlier. Sometimes the final step in healing is standing in your own truth, without apology or modification. "When?" I asked, making my decision. "Next week. Monday morning." The weekend before my testimony, I took a trip to Plum Island with Tom. We walked along the windy beach, watching sandpipers dart along the shore and seals bobbing in the distance. "Are you nervous about Monday?" he asked as we sat on a dune, sharing a thermos of coffee. "Terrified," I admitted. Not of saying the wrong thing, I just planned to tell the truth. But of seeing him again, of being back in that world. Tom nodded, understanding without platitudes. "You're stronger than you were a year ago. Whatever happens in that courtroom, remember that." He was right. The woman David had discarded no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had faced devastation and rebuilt, someone who understood her own worth beyond others' validation. Monday morning arrived with a spring rain that seemed fitting for the occasion. I dressed carefully in a navy suit I'd bought specifically for this day, professional, confident, nothing like what I would have worn during my marriage. The Suffolk County Courthouse loomed imposing against the gray sky. Martha met me on the steps, umbrella in hand, her expression reassuring. "We're the first witnesses scheduled," she explained as we passed through security. "The prosecutor wants to establish the timeline of financial deception before moving to the specific fraudulent activities." The grand jury room was less formal than I'd imagined. No judge's bench or witness box, just a conference table where jurors sat, watching me with varying degrees of interest as I was sworn in. The prosecutor, a compact man named Richard Goldberg, began by establishing my relationship to David, the duration of our marriage, and the circumstances of its end. "Ms. Callahan," he said, his tone professionally sympathetic, "could you tell the jury about the financial documents you discovered while collecting your belongings from the marital home?" Taking a deep breath, I recounted finding the folder of bank statements, describing the accounts I hadn't known existed and the large transfers to numbered accounts. As I spoke, I noticed movement at the back of the room, David entering with his attorney, his right to be present during testimony. Our eyes met briefly. He looked thinner, his typically immaculate appearance slightly frayed around the edges. A flicker of something passed across his face, not remorse exactly, but perhaps recognition of consequences he hadn't anticipated. I continued my testimony, my voice growing stronger as I detailed the financial control he'd maintained throughout our marriage, the deliberate way he'd limited my access to information, the discovery of his affair coinciding with his decision to end our marriage. "In your opinion," Goldberg asked, "was there a pattern of deception in your relationship with Mr. Manning?" I paused, considering the weight of the question. "Yes," I replied firmly. Financial deception was part of a larger pattern. Our entire relationship was built on a foundation that wasn't truthful. From there, the questions became more technical: dates, account numbers, specific transactions I might have witnessed. I answered as accurately as I could, acknowledging when I didn't know or couldn't remember. Throughout my testimony, I remained composed, my voice steady. This wasn't about revenge or even justice in the personal sense. It was about truth, the reality of what had happened, stripped of emotion or agenda. After almost 2 hours, Goldberg indicated he had no further questions. As I gathered my things to leave, I allowed myself one final glance at David. He was studying papers before him, deliberately avoiding my gaze. The power he once held over me had dissolved, replaced by a calm certainty that I had survived the worst he could do and emerged stronger. In the hallway outside, Martha squeezed my arm gently. "You did brilliantly. Clear, consistent, and credible, exactly what they needed." "What happens now?" I asked, feeling strangely hollow despite the validation. "The grand jury will continue hearing evidence. Based on what I know, it's likely they'll return an indictment. Then there will be arraignment, pre-trial motions. It could be months before an actual trial, if it even goes that far. Many of these cases end in plea agreements." I nodded, processing the information. and my part is largely done unless there's a trial. You'll be notified either way. As we descended the courthouse steps, the rain had stopped, though gray clouds still hung low over the city. The air felt fresh, washed clean by the morning's downpour. "Would you like me to call you a car?" Martha offered. I shook my head. "No, I think I'll walk for a bit. Clear my head." She studied me with professional assessment. "You're okay?" "I am," I replied, realizing with some surprise that it was true. The anxiety that had built before my testimony had dissipated, leaving behind a sense of completion. A chapter closed. I walked along the harbor, watching ferries come and go, tourists huddled in raincoats, office workers hurrying back from lunch breaks. Regular life continuing, as it always did, regardless of personal dramas. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom, "Thinking of you. Let me know when you're done." I smiled, typing a quick reply. All finished. Having a walk along the harbor, feeling better than expected. As I put my phone away, I noticed a small bookshop across the street, one of those independent places fighting to survive in the digital age. On impulse, I crossed over and went inside, welcoming the smell of paper and ink. The shopkeeper, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" "Poetry," I said, surprising myself with the answer. "Contemporary women poets." She led me to a small section at the back, pointing out several collections she recommended. I browsed, eventually selecting 3 volumes that spoke to me. At the register, she asked if I was a poet myself. "Yes," I said, the answer coming easily for the first time. "I am." The courtroom had fallen into a heavy silence as I finished my testimony. Even the judge's expression had softened into one of incredulous respect as I spoke. My words, laced with raw emotion and unwavering conviction, had echoed through the chamber. It was a moment of reckoning, where the past was acknowledged and the promise of a future defined by resilience and dignity was firmly established. 2 weeks after my testimony, the grand jury returned an indictment against David on multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and financial misrepresentation. The news made the financial section of the Boston Globe and warranted a small mention in the Wall Street Journal, not headline material, but significant in certain circles. I learned about it from Eleanor, who dropped a copy of the Globe on my desk one morning, folded to show the relevant article. "Your ex is having a bad day," she commented, her tone deliberately casual. I scanned the piece, which mentioned David's swift fall from grace at his investment firm and noted that the case had emerged following his divorce from Sarah Callahan last year. The use of my name gave me pause, a strange feeling of being simultaneously exposed and validated. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked, watching my reaction. Surprisingly, yes, I replied, handing the paper back to her. "It feels distant somehow, like it's happening to someone else." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's healing, when their actions no longer have the power to devastate you." The news sparked a flurry of texts and calls from friends and family checking on me. My mother, practical as always, wanted to know if this would affect my financial settlement. "It wouldn't," Martha assured me. Jenna suggested a David's getting what he deserves celebration dinner, which I gently declined. Even Mrs. Abernathy called from Beacon Hill to say she'd always known there was something not quite right about that young man. Tom's reaction was characteristically measured. We were having dinner at my place when I showed him the article. He read it carefully, then set it aside without comment. "What are you thinking?" I prompted, curious about his perspective. He considered for a moment. "I'm thinking that justice is complicated. This doesn't undo what he did to you personally, but there's a certain cosmic balance to it." "Cosmic balance," I repeated, liking the phrase. "Yes, that's a good way to put it." Later that evening, as we sat on my small balcony watching spring stars appear over the city, Tom took my hand, his expression unusually serious. "Sarah, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no pressure for a particular answer." My heartbeat quickened. We'd been dating for several months now, and while I valued our relationship deeply, I still harbored uncertainties about my readiness for major commitments. The community college where I sometimes teach evening classes is hosting a poetry reading series, he continued. Local voices, intimate setting. Would you consider reading some of your work? The question was so unexpected that I laughed, partly from relief and partly from genuine surprise. You want me to read my poetry? Publicly? I do, he affirmed, his eyes serious. What you've written deserves to be heard, but only if you're ready to share it. I thought about the poems I'd been writing, raw explorations of loss, betrayal, and rebuilding. They were personal, but not exclusively mine. They touched on universal experiences of dismantling and reconstruction. I'll think about it, I promised, a mixture of fear and excitement fluttering in my chest. That night, after Tom had gone home, I revisited my poetry notebook, reading through pieces I'd written over the past year. Some were too intimate to share, but others seemed to reach beyond my specific circumstances toward broader human experiences. I selected a few that felt right, not for their literary merit, which I still questioned, but for their emotional truth. The poetry reading was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in early May. The venue was the community college library, transformed with soft lighting and chairs arranged in semicircles around a small podium. About 30 people attended, students, faculty, local literary enthusiasts, and a few friends I'd nervously invited, including Jenna and Eleanor. I was third in a lineup of 5 readers, following a young man whose verses about urban life were punctuated with vibrant slang, and an older woman who read gentle nature poems with surprising depth. As my turn approached, I felt a familiar anxiety rising, the same tightness in my chest I'd experienced before testifying about David. Tom squeezed my hand reassuringly as my name was announced. I approached the podium, arranged my printed pages, and looked out at the attentive faces before me. These poems, I began, my voice initially unsteady, emerged from a period of profound personal disruption. But they're not just about endings there, about the beginnings that can follow, sometimes in unexpected ways. I read 5 pieces, each charting a different aspect of my journey, from the raw shock of betrayal to the tentative hope of new connections. As I read, my nervousness dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of rightness. These words needed to be spoken aloud, not just for my healing, but perhaps for others who might recognize their own experiences in them. After the reading, several people approached to share their responses. A young woman with tired eyes confided that she was going through a divorce and found hope in my words. An elderly man thanked me for articulating grief in a way that honored its complexity. A creative writing professor handed me her card, suggesting I consider submitting to literary journals. "You are amazing," Jenna declared on the drive home, her enthusiasm filling my car. "Seriously, Sarah, when did you get so talented?" "It's not about talent," I replied, thinking it through as I spoke. "It's about honesty, about saying the unsayable things and discovering you're not alone in them." The reading marked a turning point, not just in how others perceived me, but in how I understood myself. The identity I was constructing wasn't defined by my relationship to David or even by what had happened between us. It was something entirely new, emerging from the integration of experience into wisdom. The following week, I received a call from Martha with unexpected news. David had reached a plea agreement with prosecutors, admitting to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into his former firm's practices. "He'll likely serve some time," she explained, though probably in a minimum security facility. "The financial penalties will be substantial." "How's he taking it?" I asked, surprised by my own curiosity. There was a slight pause before Martha answered. "Not well, from what I understand." His relationship with the woman, Melissa, ended shortly after the indictment. Apparently, she wasn't interested in standing by him through legal troubles. The information should have provided some satisfaction, a confirmation of David's comeuppance, but instead, I felt a strange emptiness. His suffering didn't undo mine. His losses didn't restore what I had lost. Justice, as Tom had suggested, was indeed complicated. "Thank you for letting me know," I said, ready to close this chapter. "Is there anything else I need to do?" "Nothing legal," Martha assured me. "Your settlement is secure, and your testimony requirements are complete." "You're free to move forward, Sarah. Free to move forward." The phrase resonated, simple yet profound in its implications. That summer unfolded with unexpected richness. My work at the publishing house expanded when I was assigned to develop a new poetry imprint, a project that perfectly aligned with my rediscovered passion. Tom and I continued our relationship, finding a comfortable rhythm that respected both our connection and our independence. I expanded my balcony garden, installed bookshelves along an entire wall of my living room, and adopted a cat from a local shelter, a one-eyed tabby named Odysseus who had, according to the shelter volunteer, been through some things. In July, I received an email from the creative writing professor who had attended my reading. She had recommended my work to the editor of a small but respected literary journal who was interested in publishing a selection of my poems in their fall issue. "They're particularly interested in your sequence about rebuilding," she wrote. The editor called it quietly revolutionary in its approach to resilience. The validation was sweet, but what moved me more was the thought that my words might reach others in similar situations, people searching for language to frame their own experiences of loss and renewal. On the one-year anniversary of my divorce finalization, I decided to mark the occasion not with sorrow or celebration, but with reflection. I took the day off work and went alone to the Arnold Arboretum, a place David and I had rarely visited together. The sprawling landscape was in full summer bloom, paths winding through collections of trees and shrubs from around the world. I found a bench beneath a Japanese maple, its delicate leaves creating a canopy of dappled shade. From my bag, I took a small notebook, not my poetry journal, but a new one I'd purchased for this purpose. On its first page, I began to write a letter to myself, not about the past, but about the future I was creating. "Dear Sarah," it began. "A year ago, you thought you were at an ending. You couldn't see that it was actually a beginning." As I wrote, a light breeze stirred the maple leaves above me, sunlight shifting in patterns across the page. The simple beauty of the moment, its transience and perfection, brought tears to my eyes, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude for the capacity to experience it fully. I stayed in the Arboretum until late afternoon, walking, writing, and simply being present with myself and my thoughts. When I finally left, I felt a sense of completion, not because everything was resolved or perfect, but because I had fully acknowledged both the pain of what had happened and the promise of what was unfolding. That evening, I uploaded the final revision of my poetry collection to the Literary Journal's submission portal. Titled After Breaking, it chronicled a journey that was uniquely mine yet universally recognizable, the discovery that what shatters can also serve as foundation. 2 days later, David's sentencing was announced. 3 years in a federal prison, substantial fines, and restitution to defrauded investors. The news arrived via text from Martha, a brief factual update with no commentary needed. I was in my office when I received it, reviewing a manuscript that had captured my attention, a novel about a woman who loses everything in a natural disaster and rebuilds her life in unexpected ways. The parallels weren't lost on me, though my own disaster had been personal rather than natural. "Everything okay?" Eleanor asked, noticing my expression as I read the text. "Yes," I replied, realizing the truth of it deep in my bones. Everything is exactly as it should be. That night, Tom came over for dinner. We ate on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Odysseus curled between our chairs, occasionally batting at a passing insect with casual interest. "Did you hear about David's sentencing?" Tom asked carefully, always sensitive to topics that might be difficult. "I did," I confirmed, sipping my wine. Martha texted me. "And how do you feel about it?" I considered the question, searching for the most honest answer. "I feel free," I said finally. Not because of what's happening to him, but because it no longer defines me. His story is his story now. I have my own. Tom reached across the small table, taking my hand. "I love your story," he said simply. "Every chapter of it." The statement wasn't a declaration of forever. We weren't there yet, might never be. But it was an affirmation of the present, of the person I had become through crisis and recovery. And that was enough. More than enough. Later, as we cleared the dishes together, moving comfortably around my small kitchen, I was struck by the ordinary beauty of the moment. This was what healing looked like, not grand epiphanies or dramatic vindications, but the quiet ability to be present in one's life, to find joy in small things, to love again despite knowing that all love carries risk. In the days following my courtroom appearance and David's subsequent legal troubles, I felt a profound sense of liberation and validation. The ripple effects of that day reached far beyond the confines of legal retribution. They touched every facet of my being. I began to see the world through a lens of renewed hope and unshakable self-respect, confident that my journey had only just begun. The community's response was overwhelming. Friends, supporters, and even strangers reached out to share their admiration for my courage. I found solace in the knowledge that my struggle had resonated with others, inspiring them to confront their own adversities with similar resolve. The judge's reaction during my testimony and the courtroom's palpable shift in energy had reaffirmed that justice, while sometimes delayed, could indeed prevail. Looking back, I realized that the painful moments were the catalyst for a transformation that was both unexpected and profoundly empowering. I had taken the fragments of a shattered past and forged them into a future defined by strength, compassion, and a renewed sense of purpose. My story, once marred by despair, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, redemption is within reach, not just for me, but for anyone brave enough to walk through the fire toward a new beginning.